The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as Marcus Chen pushed his cleaning cart down the pristine hallway of St. Mary's Children's Hospital. It was well past midnight, and the pediatric ward had settled into its quiet rhythm of beeping monitors and hushed conversations between night shift nurses. His weathered hands gripped the mop handle with the same precision he had once used for far more delicate instruments, though no one who saw him now would ever guess that truth. The linoleum floor gleamed under his careful attention, each stroke of the mop deliberate and thorough. Marcus had learned that in a hospital, cleanliness wasn't just about appearance. It was about life and death, about creating an environment where healing could happen. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now contributed to that healing in the most humble way possible, invisible to the doctors and families who passed him by without a second glance. His daughter Emma's school photo smiled at him from the small frame tucked into his cart, her gap-toothed grin a reminder of why he endured the long nights and aching back. 8 years old and brilliant as a shooting star, she deserved so much more than their tiny apartment and second-hand clothes. But Marcus had learned to find dignity in honest work, even when that work meant being overlooked by people who had once called him colleague. The emergency room doors burst open with a crash that echoed through the quiet corridors. Marcus paused in his cleaning, watching as a flurry of activity erupted around a small figure on a stretcher. Paramedics rushed alongside a girl who couldn't have been much older than Emma, her face pale as moonlight against the stark white sheets. Behind them ran a woman in an expensive coat, her designer heels clicking frantically against the floor Marcus had just cleaned. Dr. Harrison Webb appeared as if summoned by the commotion, his silver hair perfectly styled even at this ungodly hour. Marcus had observed Webb for months now, had seen the way he commanded respect and deference from everyone around him. The man's reputation as chief of pediatric surgery was well earned, his skills undeniable, but Marcus had also noticed the way Webb's eyes never quite saw the people who weren't dressed in scrubs or suits. The woman in the expensive coat was speaking rapidly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from boardrooms and corner offices. Marcus caught fragments of her words as he continued his work, moving closer with the practiced invisibility that came with wearing a janitor's uniform. She was talking about specialists in New York, about flying in experts from Johns Hopkins, about money being no object when it came to saving her daughter. Victoria Sterling, Marcus realized, recognizing her from the business section of newspapers that littered the hospital break room. The CEO of Sterling Industries, one of the most powerful women in the city, reduced to a terrified mother in a hospital corridor. Money and power meant nothing when your child's life hung in the balance. The girl on the stretcher stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open to reveal the same determined gaze as her mother. Even in her weakened state, there was something fierce about her, something that reminded Marcus of Emma when she was fighting off a fever but still insisted on finishing her homework. Children possessed a resilience that adults often forgot, a will to fight that could surprise even the most experienced doctors. Dr. Webb was issuing orders with the kind of confidence that came from years of success, but Marcus noticed something in his posture, a slight tension that suggested this case was already proving more challenging than routine. The attending physicians gathered around the stretcher wore expressions of professional concern mixed with something that looked suspiciously like bewilderment. As the medical team wheeled the girl toward the elevator, Marcus caught sight of the monitors attached to her small form. The readings made his breath catch in his throat, numbers and patterns that told a story he recognized all too well. It was a story that had haunted his dreams for years, a combination of symptoms that had once been his specialty, his calling, his greatest triumph and ultimate downfall. The elevator doors closed with a soft ding, carrying the girl and her desperate mother up to the cardiac unit. Marcus stood alone in the hallway, his mop dripping forgotten water onto the floor he had just cleaned. Above him, the fluorescent lights continued their endless hum, indifferent to the drama unfolding in the floors above. He thought about Emma, safe in her bed at home, her breathing steady and strong. Tomorrow was Saturday, which meant pancakes and cartoons if he could stay awake long enough after his shift. It meant helping her with the science project that had been consuming her attention for weeks, listening to her explain photosynthesis with the same intensity other kids reserved for video games. The hospital settled back into its nighttime quiet, but Marcus found himself unable to shake the image of the girl's face, the desperate love in her mother's eyes, the subtle signs of confusion he had seen in Dr. Webb's usually confident demeanor. Somewhere above him, a family was facing the kind of nightmare that turned lives upside down, that made powerful people powerless and reduced them to hoping and praying and bargaining with God. Marcus resumed his cleaning, but his movements were mechanical now, his mind elsewhere. The cart wheels squeaked softly as he pushed it down the corridor, past the family photos that lined the walls, past the cheerful murals painted by local artists, past the donation plaques that bore the names of grateful families whose children had been saved by the skilled hands working within these walls. He paused at the window that looked out over the city, its lights twinkling like earthbound stars. Somewhere out there, people were sleeping peacefully, unaware that in this hospital, a battle was about to begin. A battle between expertise and mystery, between hope and despair, between the visible and the invisible. The night stretched ahead of him, full of floors to clean and bathrooms to scrub, but Marcus knew that something had changed. The girl upstairs had awakened something in him that he had tried to bury, a part of himself that he had thought was gone forever. In her pale face and labored breathing, he had seen an echo of every child he had ever tried to save, every family he had ever given hope to, every moment when his hands had been instruments of healing rather than tools of cleaning. Where in the world are you watching from tonight, and what time is it where you are? Whether you're settling in for the evening or just starting your day, this story of hidden talents and second chances is about to unfold in ways that will remind us all that the most extraordinary people often hide in the most ordinary places. The fluorescent lights hummed on, indifferent to the drama that was about to change everything for everyone involved. Marcus Chen, invisible in his janitor's uniform, pushed his cart toward the next corridor, unaware that the night would demand far more from him than clean floors and empty trash cans. Above him, a little girl fought for her life, and somewhere in the space between what was seen and what was hidden, a miracle was waiting to be born. The cardiac unit buzzed with unprecedented activity for the early morning hours. Marcus had finished the lower floors and made his way up to the 7th floor, where the most critical cases were housed. His cart wheels moved silently over the specialized flooring, designed to minimize noise and maximize the sterile environment necessary for healing hearts. Through the observation window of room 712, he could see the sterling girl surrounded by more medical equipment than most children would encounter in a lifetime. Monitors tracked every heartbeat, every breath, every fluctuation in her vital signs. The numbers dancing across the screens told a story that made Marcus's trained eye narrow with concern, though he kept his expression carefully neutral as he went about his work. Dr. Webb stood at the foot of the bed, his usual commanding presence somehow diminished as he studied the latest test results. 3 other physicians flanked him, their faces wearing the kind of professional masks that doctors learned to put on when they were running out of answers. Marcus had worn that same expression once, in another lifetime, when cases pushed beyond the boundaries of textbook medicine. Victoria Sterling sat beside her daughter's bed, her designer clothes wrinkled from the long night. Her hand rested gently on Isabella's forehead, stroking the dark hair that fanned across the pillow. The powerful executive who commanded boardrooms and made decisions worth millions had been reduced to the most fundamental human role, a mother watching over her sick child. Isabella stirred slightly, her eyes opening to focus on her mother's face. Even in her weakened state, she managed a small smile that transformed her pale features. Marcus found himself thinking of Emma, of the way she looked when she was fighting off a cold but still insisted on getting up for school. Children possessed an inner strength that adults often underestimated. The girl's voice was barely a whisper, but Marcus caught the words from where he worked near the doorway. She was asking about school, about whether she would miss the science fair next week. The normalcy of her concerns, the way she worried about ordinary things while extraordinary medical drama unfolded around her, struck him as profoundly moving. Dr. Webb was speaking in the measured tones doctors used when delivering difficult news to families. The tests had revealed complications that went beyond their initial assessment. The condition was rarer than they had first suspected, more complex than the standard protocols could address. He spoke of consulting with colleagues in other cities, of bringing in specialists who might have experience with similar cases. Marcus continued his work, emptying waste baskets and restocking supplies, but his attention remained fixed on the conversation unfolding in room 712. He had learned to listen with the kind of focused attention that came from years of medical training, picking up on the subtle cues that revealed more than the words being spoken. The cardiac readings were unusual, following a pattern that defied conventional diagnosis. The girl's symptoms presented like a classic case of restrictive cardiomyopathy, but the onset was too sudden, the progression too rapid. There were elements that suggested viral involvement, but the inflammatory markers were inconsistent with typical myocarditis. It was a puzzle that required the kind of deep expertise that came from years of specialization. Victoria Sterling's phone buzzed constantly, messages from assistants and board members who didn't understand that some crises couldn't be resolved with conference calls and strategic planning. She ignored them all, her focus entirely on her daughter's face, on the rise and fall of her chest, on the steady beeping of the monitors that confirmed life continuing moment by moment. A young resident entered the room, carrying a tablet loaded with the latest consultation reports. Dr. Sarah Martinez moved with the kind of nervous energy that came from being new to the high-stakes world of pediatric cardiology. Marcus had observed her over the past few months, noting her careful attention to detail and her genuine concern for her patients that hadn't yet been worn down by years of medical practice. Dr. Martinez began reading from the tablet, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. 3 major children's hospitals had reviewed Isabella's case electronically, each offering different theories but no definitive diagnosis. The girl's condition was truly extraordinary, the kind of case that would be written up in medical journals if they could solve it. Marcus finished his work in the hallway and moved on to the next room, but his mind remained focused on the puzzle unfolding behind him. The combination of symptoms reminded him of a case he had encountered years ago, during his residency at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. A young boy with similar presentations who had stumped the entire cardiac team until a visiting professor suggested a rare genetic variant that affected cellular metabolism. The memory was sharp and clear, preserved with the kind of detail that came from cases that changed the trajectory of a career. He remembered the breakthrough moment, the way the diagnosis had suddenly illuminated the path forward, the successful treatment that had saved the boy's life. That case had been the foundation of his doctoral thesis, the work that had established his reputation as a rising star in pediatric cardiology. But that was another life, another identity that he had been forced to abandon. Now he was Marcus Chen, the janitor, invisible in his uniform, trusted with trash cans and mop buckets but not with the precious lives that filled the beds around him. The irony burned in his chest, a familiar ache that had become his constant companion. The sun was beginning to rise outside the hospital windows, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Soon the day shift would arrive, bringing fresh energy and new perspectives to Isabella's case. But Marcus suspected that the answers they sought wouldn't be found in textbooks or consultations with distant experts. Some puzzles required the kind of intimate knowledge that came from having lived through similar mysteries before. His shift would end in 2 hours, and then he would go home to Emma, to pancakes and cartoons and the simple joy of being needed by someone who saw him exactly as he was. She would ask about his night, and he would tell her about the clean floors and organized supply closets, keeping to himself the story of the girl who might not see many more science fairs. The morning shift change brought a flurry of new faces to the cardiac unit, each carrying fresh hope that daylight might illuminate solutions that had remained hidden in the darkness. Marcus finished his rounds in the supply closets, methodically restocking the shelves with the precision that had become second nature. His movements were automatic now, muscle memory freeing his mind to process what he had observed throughout the night. Dr. Webb gathered his team in the conference room adjacent to Isabella's room, their voices carrying through the thin walls as Marcus cleaned the nearby nursing station. The discussion was technical, filled with medical terminology that would sound like a foreign language to most people, but to Marcus it was as familiar as his own heartbeat. They were grasping at increasingly complex theories, each more unlikely than the last. The attending cardiologist from the day shift had arrived early, Dr. Jennifer Hayes, bringing 20 years of experience and a reputation for solving difficult cases. Marcus had watched her work before, noting her methodical approach and her ability to see patterns that others missed. But even she seemed puzzled by Isabella's presentation, her usually confident demeanor showing cracks of uncertainty. Through the glass partition, Victoria Sterling remained at her daughter's bedside, having refused all suggestions that she rest or eat. Her assistant had arrived with fresh clothes and coffee, but the CEO showed no interest in maintaining her usual polished appearance. Power and wealth meant nothing when faced with a mystery that defied solution, when the most important deal of her life couldn't be negotiated or bought. Isabella had awakened with the dawn, her spirits remarkably bright considering her condition. She was asking the nurses about their families, showing the kind of genuine interest in others that spoke to her character. Despite her illness, she retained the curiosity and warmth that made her more than just another patient to the staff caring for her. Marcus found himself lingering near room 712 longer than necessary, adjusting supplies that were already perfectly organized, wiping down surfaces that gleamed with cleanliness. The pattern of Isabella's cardiac rhythm had shifted slightly since the night before, a subtle change that probably wouldn't be noticed for another hour when the next formal assessment was scheduled. The change was significant, though. It suggested a progression that Marcus recognized from his previous life, a development that could either represent natural evolution of the condition or the beginning of a dangerous deterioration. The girl's body was fighting something that the current treatment protocol wasn't addressing, something that required a different approach entirely. Dr. Martinez entered Isabella's room carrying the morning lab results, her face carefully composed in the neutral expression that medical professionals use to mask their concerns. The numbers on the report weren't encouraging, showing inflammatory markers that had increased overnight despite the aggressive treatment regimen. Whatever was affecting Isabella's heart was proving resistant to conventional intervention. Marcus moved to the small kitchenette adjacent to the cardiac unit, ostensibly to refill his cleaning supplies but actually positioning himself where he could observe the medical team's reactions. Dr. Webb was studying the lab results with the kind of intense focus that suggested he was running out of standard options, his usual confidence replaced by the grim determination of a doctor who refused to accept defeat. The morning consultation was scheduled for 10 o'clock, a video conference with pediatric cardiologists from 3 major medical centers. Marcus knew that these consultations were often exercises in collective puzzlement rather than solution finding, but they represented the current state of medical practice, collaboration across distances, sharing expertise through technology, admitting when a case exceeded local capabilities. As he worked, Marcus found his thoughts drifting to Emma, who would be waking up soon in their small apartment. She would eat the cereal he had left out for her, brush her teeth with the same methodical care he had taught her, and then settle down with her science books to continue preparing for the fair that meant so much to her. The normalcy of her routine stood in stark contrast to the medical drama unfolding around him. The irony wasn't lost on him that his daughter was studying the human circulatory system for her project, creating a detailed model of the heart that showed how blood flowed through chambers and valves to sustain life. She had asked him to help her understand the complex pathways, and he had found himself explaining concepts with the kind of detail that had surprised her. When she asked how he knew so much about hearts, he had simply said that he found the subject interesting. Dr. Hayes emerged from Isabella's room with a tablet in her hand, her expression troubled. She paused at the nursing station where Marcus was working, close enough that he could see the data displayed on her screen. The echocardiogram images showed structural abnormalities that weren't present in Isabella's previous medical records, changes that had developed rapidly over the past 48 hours. The conversation between Dr. Hayes and the head nurse was conducted in the kind of hushed tones reserved for discussions about patients whose conditions were deteriorating faster than expected. They spoke of adjusting medication dosages, of preparing for more invasive diagnostic procedures, of the need to have difficult conversations with family members about increasingly limited options. Marcus finished cleaning the nursing station and moved on to the next area, but his mind remained focused on the images he had glimpsed on Dr. Hayes's tablet. The structural changes in Isabella's heart were consistent with a rare condition he had encountered only twice in his career, both times during his fellowship at Boston Children's Hospital. It was a diagnosis that required thinking outside conventional parameters, considering possibilities that most cardiologists would dismiss as too unlikely to pursue. The condition was genetic but typically remained dormant until triggered by specific environmental factors. The onset could be sudden and devastating, progressing rapidly to heart failure if not properly managed. But with the right intervention, with treatment based on understanding the underlying mechanism rather than just managing symptoms, the prognosis could be remarkably good. The challenge was that the diagnosis required a specific test that wasn't part of the standard cardiac workup, a genetic analysis that few physicians would think to order. It was the kind of diagnostic leap that came from experience with rare cases, from having seen the impossible become possible, from understanding that sometimes the most obvious explanation was completely wrong. Marcus completed his shift as the morning consultation was beginning, the video screens in the conference room filled with the faces of experts from across the country. He gathered his supplies and prepared to leave, knowing that somewhere above him, a little girl was running out of time while the people trying to save her pursued increasingly complex theories that would lead them further from the truth. The autumn morning air was crisp as Marcus walked the 12 blocks home from the hospital, his mind unable to shake the image of Isabella Sterling's pale face. The city was waking up around him, coffee shops opening their doors, commuters hurrying towards subway stations, the ordinary rhythm of life continuing while somewhere behind him a little girl fought a battle that her doctors didn't fully understand. His apartment building stood modest and worn among the gentrifying neighborhood, a reminder of dreams deferred and circumstances that had forced him to rebuild his life from nothing. The key turned smoothly in the lock, a small sound that represented safety and home, the place where he could drop the mask of invisibility that his janitor's uniform required him to wear. Emma was already awake, her dark hair tousled from sleep as she sat at their small kitchen table surrounded by books and colored pencils. Her science project had taken over most of the available space, cardboard and construction paper transforming into an elaborate model of the human circulatory system. She looked up as he entered, her smile bright enough to chase away the exhaustion that clung to his shoulders. "Good morning, Daddy," she said, her voice carrying the kind of innocent joy that reminded him why every sacrifice was worthwhile. "Did you have a good night at work?" Her question was routine, part of their morning ritual, but today it carried weight that she couldn't possibly understand. Marcus hung his jacket on the hook by the door and moved to the coffee maker, the familiar motions buying him time to formulate an answer that wouldn't reveal the turmoil in his mind. The hospital was quiet, he told her, which was both true and completely inadequate to describe the drama unfolding in room 712. Emma returned to her project, carefully gluing red and blue strips of paper to represent arteries and veins. Her concentration was absolute, the same intensity she brought to everything she cared about. She had inherited his attention to detail, his ability to focus completely on the task at hand, traits that had once made him an exceptional surgeon and now made her an exceptional student. "Look, Daddy," she said, holding up a section of her model. "I figured out how to show the electrical system that makes the heart beat." She had drawn intricate pathways in yellow marker, representing the conduction system that regulated cardiac rhythm. Her understanding was remarkably sophisticated for an 80-year-old, her explanations revealing genuine comprehension rather than rote memorization. Marcus sat beside her at the table, marveling at her work while fighting the urge to correct small inaccuracies that didn't matter for a school project but would have been critical in a medical setting. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," he said, meaning it completely. "You understand how the heart works better than most adults." The irony of his words wasn't lost on him. Here was his daughter, studying the organ he had once been expert at repairing, while just miles away another child suffered from a condition he could probably diagnose and treat. The knowledge burned in his chest, a fire that threatened to consume the careful boundaries he had built around his new identity. Emma chattered about her upcoming presentation, about how she planned to explain the heart's function to her classmates, about the questions she hoped the judges would ask at the science fair. Her enthusiasm was infectious, but Marcus found himself thinking about another child who might not live to see her next science fair if the right intervention didn't happen soon. The morning news played quietly on their small television, the anchor's voice a backdrop to Emma's excited explanations about cardiac output and blood pressure. Marcus half listened until a familiar name caught his attention. Sterling Industries stock had dropped significantly overnight as news of the CEO's family emergency spread through financial markets. Victoria Sterling's absence from a crucial board meeting had triggered speculation about the company's stability. Even the business world was affected by what was happening in room 712, Marcus realized. The ripple effects of one child's illness extended far beyond the hospital walls, touching lives and livelihoods in ways that the doctors treating her couldn't imagine. The weight of that responsibility, the knowledge that he might hold the key to solving a puzzle that was affecting so many people, pressed down on him like a physical force. Emma noticed his distraction, her small hand touching his arm with the gentle concern that children showed when they sensed something was wrong. "Are you okay, Daddy? You look sad." Her perceptiveness was both a blessing and a challenge, her ability to read his emotions requiring him to be constantly vigilant about maintaining the facade of their simple life. "Just tired, sweetheart," he told her, which was true enough. Working nights meant that his circadian rhythms were constantly disrupted, that he lived in a state of perpetual adjustment between the world of daylight and the world of fluorescent hospital corridors. But the exhaustion he felt today went deeper than physical fatigue, reaching into the core of who he had been and who he was forced to pretend to be. Emma accepted his explanation with the trusting nature of a child who had never been given reason to doubt her father's words. She returned to her project, humming softly as she worked, the sound a melody of contentment that filled their small apartment with warmth. This was their world now, this careful balance of homework and household chores, of bedtime stories and Saturday morning cartoons, of love that flourished despite the absence of material abundance. But as Marcus watched his daughter work on her model heart, carefully crafting chambers and valves from cardboard and glue, he couldn't escape the knowledge that somewhere across the city, a real heart was failing despite the best efforts of some of the most skilled physicians in the country. Isabella Sterling needed more than good intentions and standard protocols. She needed someone who understood the rare and unexpected, someone who had seen the impossible and learned to recognize it when it appeared again. The coffee finished brewing, filling the apartment with its rich aroma, a small luxury that Marcus allowed himself despite their tight budget. He poured a cup and stood by the window, looking out at the city that held both his past and his present, both his greatest triumph and his most devastating failure. Somewhere in that sprawl of buildings and lives, a little girl was running out of time, and the person who might be able to save her was hidden in plain sight, invisible behind the uniform of a janitor and the weight of secrets that grew heavier with each passing hour. Marcus returned to the hospital that evening with Emma's excited chatter about her science project still echoing in his mind. The day shift was preparing to hand over responsibility to the night team, their faces showing the strain of another day without breakthrough in Isabella Sterling's case. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher somehow, casting shadows that hadn't been there the night before. The cardiac unit buzzed with an energy that felt different from the previous evening. More specialists had arrived throughout the day, transforming the normally quiet floor into something resembling a medical conference. Marcus counted at least 6 physicians he didn't recognize, their expensive suits and confident postures marking them as consultants brought in from other institutions. Dr. Webb moved between the newcomers like a conductor orchestrating a complex symphony, but Marcus could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his usual commanding presence had taken on an edge of desperation. 24 hours had passed since Isabella's arrival, and despite the assembled expertise, her condition continued to deteriorate in ways that defied conventional understanding. The girl herself remained remarkably spirited, her room filled with flowers and balloons that had arrived throughout the day from well-wishers who had heard about the Sterling family's crisis. Victoria Sterling had finally been persuaded to change clothes and eat something, but she refused to leave the hospital, setting up what amounted to a command center in the family conference room. Marcus began his evening routine, but found himself drawn repeatedly to the conversations happening around Isabella's care. The assembled physicians were debating increasingly exotic possibilities, discussing rare genetic disorders and unusual infectious agents with the kind of academic enthusiasm that sometimes forgot there was a real child at the center of their theoretical discussions. Dr. Martinez stood slightly apart from the main group, her tablet displaying test results that seemed to perplex her more with each review. Marcus noticed her isolation and recognized it as the position of someone whose questions weren't being taken seriously by more senior colleagues. In the hierarchy of medicine, residents learned to defer to experience even when their instincts suggested different directions. The young physician's frustration was apparent to anyone who knew how to read the subtle signs of medical politics. She had clearly identified inconsistencies in the current diagnostic approach, but her concerns were being dismissed by physicians who had invested too much pride in their initial theories to consider alternatives suggested by someone so junior. Isabella's latest echocardiogram was being displayed on the main monitor in the conference room, the images showing changes that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. The structural abnormalities had progressed exactly as he had feared they would, following a pattern that confirmed his growing suspicion about the true nature of her condition. The assembled experts were interpreting the changes as evidence of their suspected diagnoses, but they were reading the story backwards. Marcus found himself cleaning the same section of floor repeatedly, unable to move away from the window that gave him a view into the medical team's deliberations. The discussion had become heated, with different specialists advocating for increasingly aggressive interventions that would address symptoms without touching the underlying cause of Isabella's decline. Dr. Hayes was arguing for a cardiac catheterization, invasive procedure that would provide detailed images of the girl's coronary arteries but carried significant risks given her current unstable condition. Other physicians were pushing for experimental drug therapies, treatments that might buy time but could also cause complications that would make eventual recovery more difficult. The debate continued with the kind of academic intensity that physicians brought to challenging cases, but Marcus could see that they were approaching the problem from the wrong direction entirely. They were treating Isabella's condition as an acquired disease when the evidence suggested something fundamentally different, something that required a completely different therapeutic approach. His hands tightened on the mop handle as he watched Dr. Webb dismiss another suggestion from Dr. Martinez, the older physician's condescending tone making it clear that he considered her input irrelevant to the serious business of solving this complex case. The young resident's face flushed with embarrassment, but Marcus could see the determination in her eyes, the refusal to simply accept that her observations were wrong. Victoria Sterling appeared in the doorway of the conference room, her presence immediately commanding attention from every physician present. She had clearly heard enough of their debates to understand that consensus was not emerging, that the experts she had trusted to save her daughter were struggling with uncertainties that grew larger rather than smaller with each passing hour. Her voice was steady but carried an undertone of steel that reminded everyone present of her reputation for making difficult decisions under pressure. She wanted to know, in clear terms that a mother could understand, what was happening to her daughter and what concrete steps were being taken to fix it. The assembled medical team exchanged glances that spoke of their inability to provide the kind of definitive answers she was demanding. Dr. Webb stepped forward to respond, his explanation carefully crafted to sound authoritative while revealing little about the actual depth of their uncertainty. He spoke of rare conditions and complex presentations, of the need for patience while sophisticated diagnostic processes ran their course, of the importance of not rushing to premature conclusions that might compromise Isabella's care. But Victoria Sterling had not built a successful business empire by accepting vague assurances when clear answers were needed. Her questions became more pointed, her tone more demanding, her expectation of competence and results more apparent with each exchange. The physicians found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to admit that their expertise was insufficient to solve the puzzle that Isabella represented. As the conversation grew more tense, Marcus found himself moving closer to the conference room, ostensibly to empty waste baskets but actually positioning himself where he could hear every word being spoken. The assembled experts were starting to discuss the possibility of transferring Isabella to a specialty hospital, admitting that their combined knowledge might not be adequate to address her condition. The suggestion of transfer hung in the air like an admission of defeat, and Marcus could see the impact it had on Victoria Sterling's carefully maintained composure. Her daughter was dying, and the people she had trusted to save her were acknowledging their limitations in language that barely disguised their growing desperation. In that moment, Marcus felt the weight of his hidden knowledge like a physical burden. Somewhere in this room full of experts and theories and expensive consultations, a simple truth was being overlooked, a diagnosis that could change everything if someone had the courage to speak it aloud. The night deepened around St. Mary's Hospital as Marcus continued his rounds, but the usual quiet of the cardiac unit had been replaced by an atmosphere of mounting urgency. Isabella's condition had taken another turn for the worse during the evening consultation, her heart rhythm becoming increasingly unstable despite the cocktail of medications being administered through multiple 4 lines. Dr. Martinez had positioned herself at the monitoring station outside Isabella's room, her eyes fixed on the cardiac displays with the kind of focused intensity that Marcus recognized from his own residency years. The young physician had clearly identified something in the patterns that the senior attendings were missing, but her attempts to voice her concerns continued to be dismissed by colleagues who saw her inexperience as disqualifying her observations. Marcus found himself working more slowly than usual, taking extra time to organize supplies and clean surfaces that were already spotless. His proximity to the medical discussions allowed him to hear the growing desperation in the physicians' voices as they grappled with a case that seemed to defy every conventional approach they attempted. The latest round of test results had arrived an hour earlier, and the numbers told a story that made Marcus's trained eye see patterns that the attending physicians were interpreting incorrectly. Isabella's inflammatory markers had spiked again, but not in the way that would suggest the viral myocarditis that Dr. Webb continued to favor as his primary diagnosis. The pattern was more consistent with an autoimmune response, but one triggered by a specific genetic variant that most cardiologists would never think to test for. Victoria Sterling had returned to her daughter's bedside after the frustrating conference with the medical team. Her composure was beginning to crack around the edges, the strain of watching her child deteriorate while the experts tasked with saving her seemed no closer to answers than they had been 24 hours earlier. The powerful executive who commanded respect in boardrooms around the world was discovering that money and influence meant nothing when facing a medical mystery that wouldn't yield to conventional solutions. Isabella herself seemed to be fighting with remarkable determination, her small body refusing to surrender despite the mounting challenges her heart was facing. She had asked the nurses to help her sit up so she could work on a drawing, her artistic efforts producing a colorful picture of flowers and butterflies that she wanted to give to the other children in the cardiac unit. Even in her weakened state, she was thinking of others, showing the kind of generous spirit that made her more than just another patient to the staff caring for her. The drawing reminded Marcus painfully of Emma's artwork, the way his daughter approached creative projects with the same careful attention to detail and desire to share joy with others. The parallel between the two girls, one safe at home working on her science project and the other fighting for her life just floors above where he worked, created an emotional resonance that made it increasingly difficult to maintain his professional distance. Dr. Webb had called for another consultation, this time with a pediatric cardiologist from Mayo Clinic who specialized in rare genetic disorders. The video conference was scheduled for midnight, adding another layer of complexity to a case that already involved too many competing theories and not enough definitive answers. Marcus had observed enough of these remote consultations to know that they often generated more questions than solutions, especially when the local team couldn't provide a clear diagnostic framework. As the hour approached midnight, Marcus found himself positioned near the conference room where the latest consultation would take place. The assembled physicians looked tired and frustrated, their earlier confidence replaced by the grim determination of professionals who were running out of conventional options. Dr. Martinez sat at the edge of the group, her tablet displaying data that she had clearly analyzed extensively, but her junior status ensuring that her insights would likely be overlooked again. The Mayo Clinic specialist appeared on the video screen with the kind of authoritative presence that came from years of dealing with the most challenging pediatric cardiac cases. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, no relation to Marcus despite sharing his surname, had a reputation for solving puzzles that stumped other experts. Her questions were precise and probing, designed to reveal details that might have been missed in the earlier diagnostic workup. But even Dr. Chen seemed puzzled by Isabella's presentation, acknowledging that the combination of symptoms was unusual and that the progression of the condition was faster than would be expected with most of the diagnoses under consideration. She recommended additional genetic testing, but warned that the results would take several days to process, time that Isabella might not have given her current trajectory. The conversation took on an increasingly somber tone as the assembled physicians discussed the possibility that they were dealing with a condition so rare that it existed at the very edges of medical knowledge. Dr. Chen mentioned similar cases she had encountered over her career, but acknowledged that successful treatment had been achieved in only a small percentage of patients, and usually only when the diagnosis was made much earlier in the disease process. Victoria Sterling listened to the consultation from just outside the conference room, her face a mask of controlled desperation as she heard the experts admit their limitations in language that barely concealed their growing pessimism about her daughter's prognosis. The woman who had built a business empire through decisive action and strategic thinking was being forced to accept that some problems couldn't be solved through conventional approaches. Marcus continued his work, but his attention remained fixed on the medical discussion unfolding nearby. The genetic testing that Dr. Chen had recommended was exactly what was needed, but the specific variant they should be looking for was so rare that it probably wouldn't be included in the standard panel. Isabella's condition required someone to think outside the boundaries of conventional diagnostics, to consider possibilities that existed at the intersection of cardiology and genetics and environmental triggers. As the consultation concluded with more questions than answers, Marcus watched Dr. Martinez gather her materials with obvious frustration. The young resident had clearly identified inconsistencies in the current approach, but her concerns were being systematically ignored by physicians who had invested too much in their initial theories to consider alternatives suggested by someone so junior in the medical hierarchy. The night stretched ahead with no clear path forward, Isabella's condition continuing to deteriorate while the experts tasked with saving her grappled with a puzzle that seemed to grow more complex rather than clearer with each passing hour. Marcus finished cleaning the conference room as the physicians dispersed, leaving behind whiteboards covered with theories and timelines that represented the collective wisdom of some of the most skilled pediatric cardiologists in the country. But wisdom without insight was insufficient when facing the unknown, and Marcus could see that the medical team was approaching Isabella's case from assumptions that were fundamentally flawed. The answer existed, but it required someone to step outside the comfortable boundaries of conventional thinking and consider possibilities that most physicians would dismiss as too unlikely to pursue. What part of this story resonates most with you as we watch these experts struggle with a mystery that seems impossible to solve? Sometimes the most important insights come from the most unexpected sources. The alarm from room 712 pierced the quiet of the cardiac unit at 2:30 in the morning, sending nurses rushing toward Isabella's bedside with the kind of practiced urgency that came from years of responding to critical situations. Marcus dropped his cleaning supplies and moved closer, his heart pounding as he watched the medical team surround the small form on the hospital bed. Isabella's cardiac rhythm had deteriorated into a dangerous pattern, her heart struggling to maintain effective circulation despite the multiple medications flowing through her 4 lines. The monitors displayed numbers that told a story of progressive heart failure, each reading worse than the one before. Dr. Webb arrived within minutes, his hair disheveled and his usually perfect composure replaced by the grim focus of a physician facing a medical emergency. The scene unfolding in room 712 was one that Marcus had witnessed too many times in his previous career, the moment when theoretical discussions gave way to immediate action required to save a life. The medical team worked with coordinated efficiency, adjusting medication dosages and preparing for more aggressive interventions, but their efforts seemed inadequate against the relentless progression of Isabella's condition. Victoria Sterling stood pressed against the far wall of her daughter's room, her hands clasped tightly together as she watched the controlled chaos of emergency medicine unfold around Isabella's bed. The powerful executive who commanded boardrooms and made decisions worth millions had been reduced to a helpless observer, forced to trust that the people working to save her daughter possessed the skills and knowledge necessary to pull her back from the edge. Dr. Martinez had positioned herself at the monitoring station, her eyes moving between the cardiac displays and her tablet with increasing frequency. Marcus could see the young resident's frustration building as she recognized patterns in Isabella's presentation that the senior physicians continued to miss. Her suggestions were met with dismissive responses from colleagues who saw her inexperience as disqualifying her observations, despite the obvious failure of their current approach. The emergency response stabilized Isabella's immediate condition, but Marcus could see that it was a temporary fix rather than a solution to the underlying problem. The medications were masking symptoms without addressing the root cause of her deterioration, buying time that would be wasted if the medical team continued pursuing the wrong diagnostic path. As the immediate crisis passed and the extra personnel dispersed, Marcus found himself alone with Dr. Martinez in the hallway outside Isabella's room. The young physician was staring at her tablet with the kind of intense concentration that suggested she was seeing something important that others were missing. Her frustration was palpable, the result of having insights that were being systematically ignored by physicians who should have been listening. Marcus made a decision that went against every instinct for self-preservation that had guided him for the past 3 years. "Excuse me, doctor," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Martinez looked up from her tablet with surprise, clearly not expecting to be addressed by a member of the custodial staff, especially during such a critical time. "The cardiac enzyme patterns," Marcus continued, keeping his voice low to avoid attracting attention from the nurses nearby. "Have you considered familial restrictive cardiomyopathy with the RCM3 variant?" The words came out in a rush, medical terminology that felt both foreign and familiar after years of forced silence. Dr. Martinez stared at him with an expression that shifted rapidly from confusion to amazement. The condition Marcus had mentioned was so rare that most cardiologists would go their entire careers without encountering a case, but it explained every aspect of Isabella's presentation that had been puzzling the medical team. The rapid onset, the unusual inflammatory markers, the resistance to conventional treatment, all of it made perfect sense when viewed through the lens of this specific genetic variant. "How do you know about RCM3, she asked, her voice filled with wonder and suspicion in equal measure. The genetic variant had been identified only recently, described in fewer than a dozen cases in the medical literature, requiring specialized knowledge that was far beyond what anyone would expect from a hospital janitor. Marcus felt the weight of 3 years of carefully maintained invisibility pressing down on him as he realized there was no way to answer her question without revealing the truth about his identity. The moment stretched between them, filled with the recognition that Isabella's life hung in the balance while he decided whether to maintain his protective anonymity or step forward with knowledge that could save her. "I used to be a doctor," he said finally, the words feeling strange after so many years of silence. "Pediatric cardiology." The admission felt like stepping off a cliff, abandoning the safe anonymity that had protected him and Emma for so long. But watching Isabella deteriorate while her physicians pursued increasingly desperate measures had become unbearable. Dr. Martinez's eyes widened as she processed this revelation, her mind clearly racing through the implications of having a former pediatric cardiologist working as a janitor in their hospital. "The RCM3 variant requires specific genetic testing," Marcus continued, his voice gaining confidence as he returned to familiar territory. "The standard cardiac genetic panel won't include it. You need to specifically request analysis for familial restrictive cardiomyopathy variants." The young resident was nodding rapidly, her excitement building as she realized that Marcus's suggestion provided a framework that explained all the puzzling aspects of Isabella's case. "But why are you working as a janitor if you're a cardiologist?" she asked, her medical training warring with her natural curiosity about the man who had just provided the insight that had eluded an entire team of specialists. "That's a long story," Marcus replied, glancing toward Isabella's room where Victoria Sterling maintained her vigil beside her daughter's bed. "Right now, the important thing is getting that genetic test ordered. But Dr. Webb won't listen to suggestions from a resident, and he certainly won't listen to them from a janitor." Dr. Martinez understood the challenge immediately. The medical hierarchy that had frustrated her all evening would make it nearly impossible to convince Dr. Webb to order testing for such an obscure condition, especially based on a suggestion that ultimately came from a member of the custodial staff. The politics of medicine often interfered with patient care, pride and protocol taking precedence over insights that came from unexpected sources. "What if I present it as my own research?" she suggested, her determination to help Isabella overriding her concerns about the ethical implications of claiming credit for Marcus's diagnostic insight. "If I can frame it as something I discovered through literature review, Dr. Webb might be willing to consider it." Marcus nodded, recognizing the pragmatic necessity of her approach while feeling a familiar pang at having his expertise once again hidden behind someone else's credentials. The important thing was getting Isabella the correct diagnosis and treatment, regardless of who received credit for the breakthrough. But as he looked toward the room where a little girl fought for her life, he wondered how much longer he could maintain the fiction of his current identity when children's lives hung in the balance. Dr. Martinez disappeared into the medical library with her tablet and a determination that Marcus recognized from his own residency years, when impossible cases demanded hours of research and creative thinking. She had agreed to present the RCM3 variant theory as her own discovery, understanding that the medical hierarchy would never accept such a radical diagnostic suggestion from a janitor, regardless of his hidden credentials. Marcus returned to his cleaning duties with a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. After 3 years of enforced silence, speaking medical terminology aloud felt like awakening from a long dream. His hands moved automatically through familiar motions of restocking supplies and sanitizing surfaces, but his mind remained focused on Isabella's room, where her condition continued to deteriorate despite the medical team's best efforts. The night passed with agonizing slowness as Marcus waited for Dr. Martinez to complete her research and find the right moment to approach Dr. Webb with the genetic testing proposal. Isabella's monitors continued their relentless documentation of her declining cardiac function, each alarm a reminder that time was running out while conventional treatments proved inadequate against an enemy they hadn't properly identified. Victoria Sterling remained at her daughter's bedside, her vigil unbroken despite the encouragement from nurses to rest or eat. The CEO who commanded a business empire worth billions had reduced her world to the space around one hospital bed, her attention focused entirely on the rise and fall of her daughter's chest and the steady rhythm of monitors that confirmed life continuing moment by moment. Dr. Webb arrived for early morning rounds with his usual commanding presence, but Marcus could see the strain in his posture, the way his confidence had been eroded by 36 hours of failed treatments and increasingly desperate measures. The chief of pediatric surgery was facing the possibility of losing a high-profile patient despite having assembled some of the most skilled specialists in the country, a professional failure that would haunt him regardless of the complex circumstances involved. The morning medical team gathered in the conference room adjacent to Isabella's room, their faces showing the exhaustion and frustration of physicians who had run out of conventional options. The overnight deterioration in Isabella's condition had eliminated several of their remaining treatment possibilities, forcing them to consider increasingly experimental approaches that carried significant risks. Dr. Martinez entered the conference room with her tablet loaded with research about familial restrictive cardiomyopathy, her presentation carefully prepared to sound like an independent discovery rather than a suggestion from an unlikely source. Marcus positioned himself where he could observe the meeting while maintaining the invisible presence that his janitor's uniform provided. The young resident began her presentation with the kind of nervous energy that came from knowing she was about to challenge the diagnostic assumptions of senior physicians who had years more experience. She outlined the RCM3 genetic variant with methodical precision, explaining how its rare manifestation could account for all the puzzling aspects of Isabella's presentation that had confounded the medical team. Dr. Webb listened with the kind of skeptical attention that senior physicians reserved for theories proposed by residents, his expression showing polite interest rather than genuine engagement. The other attendings followed his lead, treating Dr. Martinez's presentation as an academic exercise rather than a potential breakthrough in understanding their patient's condition. But as Dr. Martinez continued her explanation, connecting the genetic variant to Isabella's specific symptoms and test results, Marcus could see that her argument was gaining traction. The theory provided a coherent framework that explained the rapid onset, the unusual inflammatory markers, and the resistance to conventional treatments that had frustrated the medical team for almost 2 days. The room fell silent as Dr. Martinez concluded her presentation, the assembled physicians processing the implications of her proposal. If she was correct, then they had been treating the wrong condition with approaches that were not only ineffective but potentially harmful. The genetic testing she was recommending would take several days to complete, but it could provide definitive answers that would completely change Isabella's treatment protocol. Dr. Webb was the first to speak, his voice carrying the cautious tone of a physician who was being forced to consider possibilities outside his comfort zone. The RCM3 variant was extraordinarily rare, he pointed out, occurring in fewer than 1 in a million patients. The probability of encountering such a case in their practice was vanishingly small, making it an unlikely explanation for Isabella's condition. But Dr. Martinez was prepared for this objection, having spent hours researching the variant and its manifestations. She pointed out that the rarity of the condition might actually explain why Isabella's case had proven so difficult to diagnose, suggesting that they were dealing with something that fell outside the normal parameters of pediatric cardiology. Sometimes the most unlikely explanation was the correct one, especially when conventional approaches had failed so completely. The debate that followed was conducted in the measured tones of academic medicine, but Marcus could hear the underlying desperation of physicians who were running out of time and options. Dr. Martinez defended her theory with passion and precision, while the senior attendings raised concerns about pursuing such an exotic diagnosis when more common explanations might still be discovered. Victoria Sterling appeared in the doorway of the conference room, her presence immediately silencing the medical debate. She had clearly heard enough of their discussion to understand that they were considering a new diagnostic possibility, and her expression demanded to know whether this represented genuine hope or merely another theoretical detour in her daughter's treatment. Dr. Webb explained the genetic testing proposal in language that a concerned mother could understand, acknowledging that it represented a significant departure from their previous diagnostic approach but might provide answers that had eluded them so far. The testing would require several days to complete, he warned, and there was no guarantee that it would confirm the suspected diagnosis. But Victoria Sterling was a woman accustomed to making difficult decisions under pressure, and she understood that conventional approaches had failed to help her daughter. If there was any possibility that genetic testing could provide answers, she wanted it ordered immediately, regardless of the statistical probability or the concerns of physicians who seemed more worried about being wrong than about saving Isabella's life. The order for specialized genetic testing was placed within the hour, samples sent to a laboratory that specialized in rare cardiac genetic variants. But Marcus knew that even if the test confirmed the RCM3 diagnosis, Isabella's condition was deteriorating too rapidly to wait for results that might come too late to save her life. The correct treatment needed to begin immediately, based on clinical suspicion rather than laboratory confirmation. As the morning progressed and Isabella's condition showed no improvement despite the medical team's continued efforts, Marcus found himself facing a choice that would determine whether his years of hiding had been justified by safety or compromised by cowardice. Somewhere in the space between his invisible present and his expert past, a little girl was dying while the knowledge that could save her remained locked behind his carefully constructed anonymity. The third night brought a crisis that no one had anticipated. Isabella's heart rhythm deteriorated into a pattern that threatened immediate cardiac arrest, the monitors screaming warnings that sent the entire medical team rushing to her bedside. Marcus watched from the hallway as Dr. Webb and his colleagues worked with desperate efficiency, their movements revealing the controlled panic of physicians who were running out of options. The emergency medications that had stabilized Isabella's condition twice before were proving less effective now, her small body developing resistance to treatments that should have bought them more time. The genetic test results wouldn't be available for another 48 hours, but Isabella's deteriorating condition suggested she might not survive another 48 minutes without a fundamental change in approach. Victoria Sterling stood pressed against the wall of her daughter's room, her face a mask of terror as she watched the medical team struggle to keep Isabella alive. The powerful woman who had built a business empire through decisive action and strategic thinking was being forced to confront the ultimate limits of wealth and influence, the recognition that some battles couldn't be won through conventional means. Dr. Martinez appeared at Marcus's side in the hallway, her face showing the strain of 3 days with minimal sleep and mounting frustration. The genetic testing she had fought to implement was proceeding, but the laboratory had warned that the specialized analysis could take up to a week to complete. Isabella's condition was deteriorating too rapidly to wait for confirmation of a diagnosis that might come too late to matter. "We need to start treatment based on clinical suspicion," she whispered to Marcus, her voice barely audible above the alarms coming from Isabella's room. "If we wait for the genetic confirmation, she's going to die." But Dr. Webb won't authorize experimental treatment for such a rare condition without definitive proof. Marcus understood the impossible position that Dr. Martinez was facing. The treatment protocol for RCM3 variant required medications that weren't part of the standard cardiac formulary, drugs that would need to be specially ordered and administered according to protocols that most physicians had never encountered. No attending physician would authorize such treatment based solely on the suspicions of a resident, especially when the diagnosis was so rare that most cardiologists would never see a case in their entire careers. The emergency team managed to stabilize Isabella's rhythm once again, but Marcus could see in their faces that they were buying borrowed time rather than achieving genuine improvement. The girl's condition was following the relentless progression that he had seen twice before in his previous career, a downward spiral that could only be stopped by addressing the underlying genetic defect rather than merely treating its symptoms. Dr. Webb emerged from Isabella's room with the exhausted expression of a physician who was being forced to acknowledge the limits of his expertise. The assembled specialists had done everything that current medical protocols recommended, but their patient continued to deteriorate despite their best efforts. The chief of pediatric surgery was facing the possibility of losing a high-profile case that would haunt his reputation and conscience for the rest of his career. Marcus made a decision that he had been avoiding for 3 days, a choice that would shatter the carefully constructed anonymity that had protected him and Emma for so long. He approached Dr. Webb in the hallway outside Isabella's room, his heart pounding as he prepared to abandon the invisible safety of his janitor's uniform. "Doctor," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority that came from years of medical training despite his current humble appearance. "I need to speak with you about Isabella Sterling's case. There's something you need to know." Dr. Webb turned to face him with the kind of dismissive attention that senior physicians typically gave to support staff who interrupted their work. His expression showed polite irritation rather than genuine interest, clearly expecting a routine question about cleaning schedules or supply requirements rather than medical insight. "I'm Dr. Marcus Chen," Marcus continued, using his former title for the first time in 3 years. "I was chief of pediatric cardiology at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia before I came here. Isabella has familial restrictive cardiomyopathy with the RCM3 variant, and she's going to die unless we start the correct treatment immediately." The words hung in the air between them, creating a moment of stunned silence as Dr. Webb processed the impossibility of what he was hearing. A janitor claiming to be a former chief of cardiology was absurd enough, but one who was offering specific diagnostic insights about their most challenging case crossed the line into either delusion or revelation. Dr. Webb's expression shifted from irritation to skepticism to something approaching wonder as he began to consider the implications of Marcus's claim. If this man was truly a former pediatric cardiologist, his insights about Isabella's condition could represent the breakthrough they desperately needed. But if he was delusional or fraudulent, following his suggestions could prove disastrous for their patient and their careers. "Prove it," Dr. Webb said finally, his voice carrying the challenge of a physician who had been confronted with the impossible. "If you're really Dr. Marcus Chen, then you'll know details about pediatric cardiology that a janitor couldn't possibly understand." Marcus took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice gaining confidence as he returned to the medical territory that had once been his domain. He described the RCM3 variant with precision that could only come from direct experience, outlining the specific genetic defect that caused cellular dysfunction in cardiac muscle fibers. He explained the treatment protocol that had been developed at Boston Children's Hospital, the combination of medications that could halt the disease progression if administered correctly. As Marcus spoke, Dr. Webb's skepticism gave way to amazement and then to something approaching awe. The depth of knowledge being displayed was far beyond what any imposter could have researched, the kind of intimate understanding that came only from years of specialized training and direct clinical experience with the rarest cardiac conditions. The conversation attracted the attention of other medical staff, who gathered in the hallway to witness the extraordinary scene of a hospital janitor demonstrating expertise that rivaled the most skilled specialists in their field. Dr. Martinez stood at the edge of the group, her face showing vindication mixed with wonder as she realized that her diagnostic suspicions had been confirmed by someone with the credentials to make definitive treatment recommendations. Victoria Sterling emerged from her daughter's room, drawn by the commotion in the hallway and the recognition that something significant was happening among the medical staff. Her expression showed desperate hope as she realized that new expertise had somehow materialized at the moment when conventional medicine had reached its limits. Marcus felt the weight of years of hidden identity lifting from his shoulders as he spoke, the relief of finally being able to use his knowledge openly overwhelming the fear of exposure that had controlled his life for so long. Isabella's life hung in the balance, and the treatment she needed was within reach if he had the courage to step fully into the light and reclaim the identity he had been forced to abandon. The transformation was immediate and startling. As Marcus shed his janitor's uniform and donned scrubs that a nurse had quickly retrieved, he seemed to grow taller, his posture straightening with the confidence that came from reclaiming his true identity. The invisible man who had cleaned floors for 3 years was replaced by Dr. Marcus Chen, whose reputation in pediatric cardiology had once been known throughout the medical community. Dr. Webb struggled to process the revelation, his mind racing through the implications of having a former chief of cardiology working unrecognized in their hospital. The questions about how and why Marcus had ended up in such circumstances would have to wait. Isabella's condition was deteriorating by the minute, and if this man truly possessed the expertise to save her, those answers could come later. Victoria Sterling watched the transformation with the kind of desperate hope that came from witnessing the impossible become possible. Her daughter was dying despite the efforts of some of the most skilled physicians in the country, but now someone with even greater expertise had stepped forward at the moment when conventional medicine had reached its limits. The powerful executive who was accustomed to controlling outcomes through wealth and influence found herself placing her faith in a man who had been invisible just moments before. Marcus approached Isabella's bedside with the focused intensity that had once made him legendary among his colleagues. His hands moved with practiced precision as he examined the monitors, interpreting the data with an expertise that was immediately apparent to everyone watching. The cardiac patterns that had puzzled the medical team for 3 days told him a clear story, confirming his diagnosis and outlining the treatment path that could save Isabella's life. The medication protocol for RCM3 variant was complex and counterintuitive, requiring drugs that worked against conventional cardiac treatment approaches. Marcus began issuing orders with the authority of someone who had treated this exact condition before, his instructions precise and confident despite the years that had passed since he had last stood at a patient's bedside as a practicing physician. Dr. Martinez assisted with an enthusiasm that bordered on reverence, finally working alongside someone who understood the condition she had helped identify. The young resident's earlier frustrations were vindicated as Marcus confirmed her insights and built upon them with the kind of deep knowledge that came from direct clinical experience with the rarest cardiac conditions. The nursing staff responded to Marcus's presence with the immediate recognition that comes when true expertise enters a room. His commands were clear and purposeful, each instruction based on intimate understanding of how Isabella's genetic variant would respond to specific interventions. The atmosphere in the cardiac unit shifted from desperate improvisation to coordinated precision. Isabella herself seemed to sense the change in the room's energy, her eyes opening to focus on the new face beside her bed. Marcus spoke to her with the gentle authority that had once made him beloved by his young patients, explaining what he was doing in language that an 11-year-old could understand while maintaining the honesty that children deserved when facing serious medical challenges. The first medication took effect within 30 minutes, Isabella's cardiac rhythm stabilizing in ways that conventional treatments had been unable to achieve. The monitors that had been screaming warnings for hours settled into patterns that indicated genuine improvement rather than temporary stabilization. Marcus watched the displays with the satisfaction of a physician who had seen this exact response before, knowing that they had finally identified and begun treating the correct condition. Dr. Webb observed the transformation in Isabella's condition with amazement that bordered on disbelief. 3 days of intensive treatment by multiple specialists had failed to achieve what Marcus had accomplished in less than an hour. The chief of pediatric surgery was witnessing the kind of medical breakthrough that happened perhaps once in a career, the moment when expertise and circumstance aligned to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. Victoria Sterling moved closer to her daughter's bedside, tears streaming down her face as she watched Isabella's color improve and her breathing become less labored. The CEO who commanded boardrooms and made decisions worth billions had been reduced to grateful silence, understanding that the man who had saved her daughter's life had been hidden in plain sight while she had frantically sought experts from around the world. As the evening progressed, Isabella's improvement continued at a pace that seemed almost miraculous to the medical staff who had watched her deteriorate for so long. The specialized medications were addressing the underlying genetic defect that had caused her cardiac dysfunction, allowing her heart to function normally for the first time since her illness began. Marcus found himself surrounded by physicians who wanted to understand how he had known to order treatments that none of them had considered. His explanat ion of the RCM3 variant and its manifestations was delivered with the authority of someone who had published extensively on the subject, though he carefully avoided mentioning the research that had been conducted under his name at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. The questions about his background would inevitably come, Marcus knew, but for now the focus remained on Isabella's care and the continued administration of treatments that were proving remarkably effective. The genetic test results that would arrive in 2 days would confirm what clinical response had already demonstrated, but the girl's life had been saved by acting on expertise rather than waiting for laboratory confirmation. Dr. Martinez stayed close to Marcus throughout the evening, absorbing everything she could learn from someone who had become an unexpected mentor. The young resident's earlier frustrations were forgotten as she witnessed the kind of diagnostic brilliance that medical schools tried to teach but could rarely replicate. This was medicine at its highest level, where knowledge and intuition combined to solve puzzles that defeated conventional approaches. As midnight approached and Isabella's condition continued to stabilize, Marcus allowed himself to feel the satisfaction that came from using his skills to save a life. The years of hiding his identity had been necessary for his own protection, but watching Isabella respond to proper treatment reminded him of why he had become a physician in the first place. The transformation from janitor to savior was complete, but Marcus understood that his carefully constructed anonymity was now shattered forever. Emma would need to know the truth about his past, hospital administration would demand explanations, and the medical community would want to understand how one of their own had disappeared only to resurface in the most unexpected circumstances. But as he watched Isabella sleep peacefully for the first time in days, her monitors displaying the steady rhythms of a healing heart, Marcus felt that the sacrifice of his hidden safety had been worthwhile. Sometimes the most important moments in life required stepping into the light, regardless of the consequences that might follow. What does this moment mean to you, watching someone risk everything to save a life? Have you ever had to choose between staying safe and doing what you knew was right? These are the choices that define us, the moments when our true character emerges from behind whatever masks we wear to protect ourselves. Dawn broke over St. Mary's Hospital with Isabella Sterling sitting up in bed for the first time in 4 days, her color restored and her smile bright enough to illuminate the entire cardiac unit. The transformation was so dramatic that nurses who hadn't seen her during the crisis could hardly believe this vibrant child was the same patient who had been fighting for her life just hours earlier. Marcus stood beside her bed reviewing the morning's test results, the numbers confirming what visual observation had already demonstrated. Isabella's cardiac function had returned to nearly normal parameters, the specialized medications having successfully interrupted the genetic cascade that had threatened her life. The RCM3 variant that had stumped an entire team of specialists was responding exactly as Marcus had predicted it would. Victoria Sterling had finally been persuaded to shower and change clothes, her relief so profound that she seemed to float rather than walk through the hospital corridors. The CEO who had built an empire through calculated risks and strategic decisions had discovered that the most important victory of her life had come through trusting a man whose expertise had been hidden behind a janitor's uniform. Dr. Webb approached Marcus with the kind of respectful deference that one expert showed to another, his earlier skepticism replaced by professional admiration for the diagnostic brilliance he had witnessed. The chief of pediatric surgery had questions that went beyond Isabella's medical care, curiosities about how such exceptional talent had ended up scrubbing floors in his hospital. The genetic test results arrived that afternoon, confirming what Marcus's clinical diagnosis had already established. Isabella carried the RCM3 variant in exactly the configuration that he had suspected, the laboratory findings validating treatment decisions that had been made based on expertise rather than data. Dr. Martinez practically glowed with vindication, her earlier insights having been proven correct through the most dramatic possible demonstration. As word of the remarkable case spread through the hospital, Marcus found himself the center of attention in ways that made him profoundly uncomfortable. Physicians from other departments came to the cardiac unit hoping to meet the mysterious doctor who had solved the puzzle that had defeated multiple specialists, their curiosity about his background growing with each retelling of Isabella's miraculous recovery. The questions about his past became increasingly difficult to deflect, especially when hospital administration began requesting documentation of his medical credentials and employment history. Marcus knew that his carefully constructed identity was unraveling, that the safety he had built for himself and Emma was crumbling with each hour that passed since his revelation. Isabella herself provided the most poignant moments of the day, her recovery so complete that she was already asking about returning to school and whether she would be able to participate in the science fair she had been preparing for. The 11-year-old who had been at death's door was now focused on the normal concerns of childhood, her resilience a testament to both her character and the effectiveness of proper treatment. Marcus found time to call Emma during his break, carefully explaining that something important had happened at work that would require them to have a serious conversation when he came home. His daughter's voice carried the innocent concern of a child who sensed that their world was about to change, though she couldn't possibly understand the magnitude of the transformation that was already underway. The afternoon brought visits from medical colleagues who had worked with Marcus during his previous career, physicians who had heard about the remarkable case through the informal networks that connected pediatric cardiologists across the country. Their recognition of his expertise was immediate and enthusiastic, but their questions about his disappearance from academic medicine were harder to answer. Dr. Hayes pulled Marcus aside late in the afternoon, her expression showing the kind of professional concern that senior physicians felt when they encountered evidence of talent being wasted. She had done some research into his background, discovering the publications and presentations that had established his reputation before his mysterious departure from Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. The conversation that followed was both inevitable and painful, as Marcus found himself explaining circumstances that he had hoped never to discuss again. The malpractice lawsuit that had destroyed his career had been based on false accusations from a family whose child had died despite his best efforts, their grief transformed into blame that had found receptive ears among lawyers seeking profitable targets. The truth about the case was complex and tragic, involving a patient whose condition had been beyond the reach of any intervention despite the family's expectations that medical expertise should be able to solve any problem. Marcus had been exonerated eventually, but not before the legal process had consumed his savings, destroyed his reputation, and forced him to rebuild his life in circumstances that protected him and Emma from further scrutiny. Dr. Hayes listened with the understanding of someone who had witnessed the arbitrary cruelties that sometimes befell dedicated physicians, the recognition that even the most skilled doctors could be destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. Her offer to help restore his medical credentials was both generous and complicated, requiring Marcus to decide whether he was ready to risk the visibility that would come with returning to his former profession. Isabella's complete recovery became the talk of the medical community, a case study in diagnostic excellence that would be discussed in conferences and published in journals for years to come. But Marcus found little satisfaction in the professional recognition, his focus remaining on the practical challenges of explaining his situation to Emma and deciding whether to accept the opportunities that were already being offered. Victoria Sterling requested a private meeting that evening, her desire to express gratitude complicated by curiosity about the man who had saved her daughter's life while working in circumstances that seemed to waste his extraordinary talents. The conversation took place in the family conference room, away from the curious eyes of medical staff who had been watching Marcus's every move. The CEO's questions were direct and practical, focused on understanding how someone with his credentials had ended up in such circumstances and what could be done to restore him to the position his skills deserved. Her offer of financial assistance and legal support was both generous and potentially life-changing, representing resources that could eliminate the constraints that had forced Marcus into hiding. But Marcus understood that accepting her help would mean abandoning the anonymity that had protected him and Emma for 3 years, stepping into a spotlight that could bring both opportunities and renewed vulnerabilities. The decision would affect not just his own future but Emma's as well, requiring him to choose between safety and the chance to use his talents openly once again. As the evening settled over the hospital and Isabella continued her remarkable recovery, Marcus prepared to leave for home and the conversation with Emma that would explain how their quiet life was about to change forever. The janitor who had arrived for work 4 nights earlier no longer existed, replaced by a physician whose expertise had been revealed in the most dramatic possible circumstances. 3 weeks later, Marcus walked through the corridors of St. Mary's Hospital wearing scrubs instead of a janitor's uniform, his name badge reading Dr. Marcus Chen, attending pediatric cardiologist. The transformation was complete, but the journey to this moment had required conversations and decisions that had changed everything about his and Emma's carefully constructed life. The evening he had returned home to explain everything to Emma remained one of the most difficult of his life. His 80-year-old daughter had listened with the solemn attention that children brought to moments when they sensed their world was shifting. Her questions had been practical rather than emotional, focused on understanding how their life would change rather than why he had hidden his true profession for so long. "Daddy, does this mean you won't have to work nights anymore?" she had asked, her concern revealing the sacrifices that his previous job had required from both of them. The answer was complicated, involving hospital schedules and patient responsibilities that would still require irregular hours, but Marcus had been able to assure her that their time together would increase rather than diminish. The legal proceedings to restore his medical credentials had moved with surprising speed, aided by Victoria Sterling's resources and the testimonials of colleagues who had witnessed his expertise firsthand. The false accusations that had destroyed his career were formally dismissed, the legal record cleared of the allegations that had forced him into hiding. Justice had finally prevailed, though it had taken years longer than it should have. Isabella Sterling had become his first official patient after his credentials were restored, her follow-up care providing continuity between his dramatic re-emergence and his return to regular practice. The girl's recovery had been complete and permanent, the RCM3 variant successfully managed through ongoing medication that would allow her to live a normal life. Her science fair project had won first place, a presentation about cardiac genetics that drew heavily on her personal experience as a patient. Dr. Martinez had been promoted to chief resident in pediatric cardiology, her role in Isabella's case having demonstrated the kind of diagnostic thinking that marked her for rapid advancement. She worked closely with Marcus now, their partnership built on mutual respect and the shared experience of having solved an impossible case through unconventional means. The hospital administration had handled Marcus's unusual situation with discretion and professionalism, more interested in retaining his expertise than investigating the circumstances that had brought him to their institution. His transition from custodial staff to medical staff had been managed quietly, avoiding the kind of publicity that might have compromised his family's privacy. Emma's science project had evolved significantly since Marcus's revelation, her model of the human circulatory system now accompanied by detailed explanations that reflected access to expert knowledge. She spoke about cardiac function with the confidence of someone who had learned from a true specialist, her presentation captivating teachers and students who marveled at her sophisticated understanding. Victoria Sterling had kept her promise to support Marcus's return to medicine, but her assistance had extended beyond legal and financial help. Sterling Industries had established a research grant at St. Mary's Hospital specifically focused on rare pediatric cardiac conditions, ensuring that other children with unusual presentations would have access to the kind of specialized care that had saved Isabella's life. The partnership between Marcus and the Sterling family had grown into friendship, their bond forged through shared experience of crisis and recovery. Isabella visited the cardiac unit regularly, bringing drawings and updates about her life to the medical staff who had become like extended family to her. Her presence served as a reminder of why their work mattered, a living testament to the power of expertise applied with courage and compassion. Dr. Webb had become one of Marcus's strongest supporters, their professional relationship built on mutual respect for each other's skills and dedication to pediatric care. The chief of surgery had publicly acknowledged Marcus's role in Isabella's recovery, using the case as an example of why hospitals needed to remain open to insights from unexpected sources. The medical community had embraced Marcus's return with enthusiasm, his publications and presentations resuming with case studies that drew on his unique perspective as someone who had observed healthcare from multiple vantage points. His experience as a janitor had given him insights into hospital operations that enhanced his effectiveness as a physician, making him a more complete healer. Marcus's new office overlooked the pediatric ward where he had once worked anonymously, the view serving as a daily reminder of the journey that had brought him back to his true calling. The nameplate on his door represented more than professional restoration, it symbolized the triumph of expertise over circumstance, of truth over false accusation, of courage over fear. Emma had adapted to their new life with the resilience that children showed when change brought improvement rather than loss. Her father's regular schedule allowed for family dinners and homework help, weekend activities and bedtime stories that had been sacrificed during his years of night shift work. Their small apartment had been replaced by a house with a yard where she could play and garden, the financial stability of his medical practice providing opportunities that had been impossible before. The transformation extended beyond personal circumstances to professional impact, as Marcus's return to medicine coincided with his development of new protocols for diagnosing rare cardiac conditions in children. His experience with Isabella's case had revealed gaps in standard diagnostic approaches, leading to research that would help other physicians recognize unusual presentations before they became life-threatening crises. The evening routine in their new home had become a cherished ritual, with Emma sharing details of her school day while Marcus described interesting cases in language that satisfied her scientific curiosity without violating patient confidentiality. Their conversations reflected the easy companionship of two people who had weathered difficult times together and emerged stronger for the experience. As Marcus tucked Emma into bed in her new room, surrounded by books about science and medicine that reflected her growing interests, he marveled at how dramatically their lives had changed through a single moment of choosing courage over safety. The decision to step forward and help Isabella had required abandoning the anonymity that had protected them, but it had also restored the identity that made him most effective at helping others. The future stretched ahead filled with possibilities that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Marcus would continue treating children with cardiac conditions, his expertise now openly available to families facing the kind of crisis that had once seemed insurmountable. Emma would grow up knowing her father's true profession, her pride in his work evident in the way she spoke about his role in saving lives. Looking back on the journey from janitor to healer, Marcus understood that some transformations required dismantling carefully constructed defenses in order to become who you were meant to be. The safety of invisibility had served its purpose, but the call to help others had ultimately proven stronger than the desire to remain hidden. If this story has touched your heart and reminded you that extraordinary people often hide in ordinary places, we'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Sometimes the most powerful moments come when someone finds the courage to step into the light and use their gifts to help others, regardless of the personal cost. Subscribe for more stories that celebrate the hidden heroes among us, the people whose quiet courage changes lives in ways that matter most.